The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect those of 90.1 FM, KKFI, Mid-Coast Radio Project, its board, staff, and volunteers.
KKFI's Racial Justice Initiative up next. This is Stand Up.
Able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Stag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Sid Roxy.
Hey, y'all. Hey, this is Dr. Nicole Price for the Racial Justice Initiative here on KKFI 90.1 FM. And I am without my sidekick tonight, Betty Leigh Shackelford. We are so sad to be missing you this evening. I do want to say that when I came up with the idea of trading spaces, it was a play on the title from the movie that Eddie Murphy was in, which if you haven't seen it is still pretty funny today. But it also was inspired from the movie A Time to Kill. If you haven't seen the movie, Samuel L. Jackson is the main character, and his daughter has been killed by some white supremacists, and he's in a southern town, and she's beaten within an inch of her life, dropped in a ravine, and left for dead. And she survives it. And Samuel L. Jackson kills the perpetrators. But the attorney is Matthew McConaughey. And of course, if you don't know this actor, he's white. And while he's trying to appeal to the jurors, he tells the entire story as I just did and takes the listener all the way through all the gory details of what happened to this small child while their eyes are closed. He asks them to have their eyes closed. And before they open their eyes, he says, I want you to imagine that that child were white. And it was one of the first times in my life that I was sparked into consciousness just by imagining that all the things that happen in the US related to race and the racial hierarchy and the social arrangement we have here in America, what if they were the reverse? How would we behave? And so I want to bring us forward to something that happened this week, and I'm interested in just your opinion. So feel free to call in or send questions in now, but we're going to listen to a citizen of Kansas City talking specifically about this idea of trading spaces. Laura McDonald from War Squared. Let's tee that up.
At Chick-fil-A instead of go chicken go, you would be up in arms like me. Right? Yeah, it is he, it's the word is whatever he was, you uphold it, and there are two black men on this board who tried to do something about it.
So again, the person you're hearing is Laura McDonald, and she's the executive director of an organization called More Squared. And they do community activism surrounding trying to organize faith-based institutions for social justice. And Laura says she's contrasting. There was an incident here in Kansas City where a 15-year-old boy was a passenger in a car, and he's Black, and he's at a chicken place, fried chicken place called Go Chicken Go. And if you're not from here, you might not realize that Go Chicken Go is right in the heart of the city in a predominantly Black part of town in what is historically been one of the ridden with some of the most violent crime statistics in the city. And he gets asked to crawl across the parking lot and ends up with his teeth getting knocked out or kicked out, one of the two, by police officers. And so Laura is at the Board of Police Commissioners, and her question is, if this were a white child who is 15 years old at a Chick-fil-A, would we be silent about these issues? And I'm pretty sure that the answer to that question is no, we would not be silent about these issues. And so I'd love to hear from you. Please call in with questions or comments at 816-931-5534. What's your perspective on these types of issues? Do you believe that if things were reversed, that we would be silent on these issues? One thing that has just come up recently today in the media is about Black athletes who are deciding that they want to go to historically Black colleges and universities. Now, I imagine if you tune into this show, you already know that the reason historically Black colleges and universities even exist is because Black people were not allowed to attend predominantly white institutions, were restricted by law. And so Roland Martin posted on Twitter today, he said, y'all see the sheer arrogance of folks like Doug Gottlieb, because he said that Travis Hunter Jr., who's the top recruit in the nation, is going to Jackson State University, which is a historically Black college or university. And Doug thinks that is just a really terrible idea. And so Roland Martin says, well, why can you explain to me why going to a school that has an 11-1 record would be problematic? And so here's what's interesting. Doug, who's a white man, responds with, HBCU football doesn't have close to the same support athletically, academically, medically, and they play an inferior schedule with inferior teammates. He goes on to say, in addition of football, addition of football ends, any person would prefer to be a UGA, FSU, TAMU alum for help in the workforce. And so I wasn't even quite sure where to start with this tweet when I saw it earlier today, but I decided to start with inferior teammates. So clearly the students at historically Black colleges and universities are by and large Black students. And so what besides the fact that they are Black students makes them inferior? That's my question of Doug. And I think I have more patience than most people, but I really want to hear from you also. I want people to call in and let us know what you think, or at least type your question or comment in the chat, because when we won't acknowledge that when we created the Constitution in the United States of America, that we decided that people with Black skin or African ancestry were going to be considered 3/5 human, and we won't even acknowledge that, then it gets into the psyche of people like Doug that, yes, somehow Black skin is inferior. And my question would be, can you imagine that instead of going to Jackson State, that perhaps there was, or let's say he was going to Jackson State, which is an HBCU, and let's imagine that the coach there was Brett Favre. If you don't watch football, Brett Favre is a very white man. And let's imagine that a Black student decided that they were going to go to Jackson State to play for Brett Favre. Would we make those same accusations that I don't understand why you would go to a historically Black college or university? And the reason why I think this is so important is because the subtlety of the racism in this tweet can be missed by so many people. In fact, I imagine that Doug is probably described by his friends as a really nice person without a racist bone in his body. And yet there's something in him that would suggest that a historically Black college and university has inferior teammates. And that was the language that he chose to use. Now, I just want to share a few stats about HBCUs and Black people. 85% of all Black doctors graduate from historically Black colleges and universities. 80% of all Black federal judges graduated from historically Black colleges or universities. 75% of all Black people who have terminal degrees, PhDs, EDDs, JDs, came from historically Black colleges and universities. 75% of all Black military officers graduated from historically Black universities. And I could go on and on and on. And I am not so sure that I would say that the academics at an HBCU is better than what you would get at a predominantly white institution. But I would say it is equal to what you would get at a predominantly white institution, if for no other reason besides you can go to an HBCU as a Black person and have 99 problems, but guess what isn't one? Racism. You can rest assured that if you have a teacher who is treating you unfairly, that they're just treating you unfairly because they're a bad person. You know for sure that they're not treating you poorly because of something you cannot control, impact, or change, like the color of your skin. And so for this reason, I look at this tweet where we say HBCUs don't have close to the same support athletically. Well, if that were true, why is it then that all of these Black athletes are sitting on the bench at predominantly white institutions, helping to prep white students to be better at their craft? Why is it that every time that we open up the field of sport to include Black and brown people, why is it that when the playing field is level, we end up operating at the highest level? In golf, in tennis, in swim, in ballet, in gymnastics, in football, in basketball, in every single sport you can imagine. That is because when the playing field is level, you will not have disparity based on race. And so this takes me to my greater question that was inspired again by Laura McDonald over at Moore Square, inspired by Samuel L. Jackson and his amazing artistry on screen for A Time to Kill. What if these were white children we were talking about? What if Black people were saying of white children, white student athletes, I don't know why they would go to KU or MU. That place is subpar athletically. And we had the entire airwaves available to us to be able to spew that nonsense about white children. And I maintain that the reason why you can't imagine it is because I can't find it. You cannot find a decent number of Black adults to attack white children. You can't find it. This year, the issue with Ruby Bridges going to and being able to integrate schools in the South at 5 years old. And if you've ever seen the painting that was done of her, she's flanked by federal marshals on both sides. And you see her little body there with pigtails and tomato splatter on the wall. Actual physical objects like soda cans have been thrown at her. And I just want you to imagine that were a little white girl. And imagine that those federal marshals were Black men. And imagine that there were a mob of Black people standing outside of the schoolhouse steps, not a high school, not a college, not a middle school, but this is a kindergartner. And I want you to imagine adult Black men, women, trans people throwing objects at a 5-year-old white child. You cannot imagine it because it just would not happen. I challenge anybody who's listening to us right now to find me a dozen Black women who would be willing to throw physical objects at a white 5-year-old baby. You can't find it. You can't find it. And so what I love to do in sessions when we're talking about the strategies for resolving our racial issues in America is I love to ask white people to imagine, what if it were you? You can take healthcare, you can take criminal justice, you can take the traffic issue in Atlanta, and we're going to talk about that at the bottom of the hour. We can discuss food deserts, whatever you want. And imagine that it was your skin color that prevented you from having access. Imagine it was your skin color that caused you to have a greater interest rate at a bank, not related to credit score. Imagine it was your skin color that dictated where you lived, who you could marry, where you went to school, whether or not you would die in birth. What would you want to happen? And when I allow people, mostly white people, to just sit with that idea for 20 minutes or so and come up with their list, I can tell you exactly what the order is without having any notes in front of me. Number one, tear this whole system down. Tear it down. Start over. We are not doing this. We need to revolt. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Number two, reparations. I want to be paid for my pain and suffering so I can start over. Number three, representation in every single level of government. I want white people on the bench. I want white people in Congress. I want white people in the presidency, in the administration. I want people at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. 20 minutes. And I believe that we have the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of another. The challenge is understanding that if I do something, if I do that, it is going to cost me something. But to what end? You know, every Thursday I work out with a trainer, and it's virtual. You probably can't tell from looking at me because I don't do anything she says. And in that way, I'm kind of like white people. I have all the power in this situation. If I don't want to log in, I don't. If I don't want to eat right, I don't. I have the money to pay her to waste her time. She gets on 3 days a week and she pushes me strenuously. And I'm looking at her and I do exactly what she says while she's watching me. The moment she hangs up, I can't wait to leave this studio to get me something. There's a special beer I like. It's called Mango Cart, and I can only get it here in this area. And I can't wait to go get a whole case for myself for the next week. And it was so amazing this morning. It occurred to me that she thinks she has power. She thinks that she can cajole and talk me into doing the right thing. And I say, oh, change is so hard. Change ain't hard. Change is hard for those people who are not ready. And if you are not ready to change, there is absolutely nothing anybody can do to cause you to make that shift. Not even my trainer. But here's the kicker, and this is how I'm also like white people. Me not doing what she's suggesting, it ain't hurting her. It's hurting me too. And what if, I love to ask this question because I think people think that racism benefits certain people. But I will say this, what if the cure to cancer is sitting in some dilapidated, underfunded school where mostly Black and brown children attend? Cancer impacts 1 in 3 U.S. citizens. If you live to be 40 years old, you have a 34% chance of getting some form of cancer. And what if the answer to cancer is in the mind of a Black child sitting in some dilapidated school district? Or what if they're not sitting in a dilapidated school district? What if they're sitting out in Lee Summit with a bunch of teachers who are not culturally responsive or not racially sensitive, crushing their spirits, killing their dreams. Is that just impacting Black people? Does that just keep the social arrangement in place for Black people? Or does that negatively impact all of us? Heather McGhee wrote a beautiful book called The Sum of Us, and she says what racism cost all of us. And she clearly lays out how when we decide that we are going to dig in and embrace and keep building on this concept that was completely made up, that we all suffer. And what I think is interesting is that the producer tonight asked me, she said, about the police commissioners meeting, she said, I wonder if they have the ears to hear. And I'll just tell you, when I'm with my trainer, I'm hearing her all right. Doesn't change my actions. And it is difficult to acknowledge that we have racist ideas. It is difficult to acknowledge that we have benefited from the racist systems, practices, and policies. But I maintain that that's the hard work that we need to do in order to be able to turn this thing around. And if we can just trade spaces, even in our minds, and ask ourselves, what would I want to happen if it were me? What if Travis Scott were the number one recruit in the country and he were white and he decided that he was going to go to Harvard? Not a single person would say, why would he go there? I mean, they don't have the same support athletically. They've got an inferior schedule and inferior teammates. When was the last time you saw Harvard in March Madness? When were they in your bracket? And no one would make that assertion because we believe that somehow things that are white are better. How do I know that? How can I be so emphatic in saying that? I need y'all to call in too, because I don't want to just, I'm missing my sidekick tonight, Betty Leigh Shackelford. We miss you, honey. I hope you're tuning in, even though you couldn't make it. Call us. Let us know what you think, because, opinions can be agreed with or disagree with. I'm spitting a lot of facts, so it's probably hard to agree or disagree with the facts. But if you have some different facts, call in. 816-931-5534. We'd love to hear from you. But I think it's interesting when we are talking about schools, because I brought up what happened with Ruby Bridges. Can you imagine that if during Brown versus the Board of Education, we decided we weren't going to integrate schools with the kids, that we were going to do it with the adults? Do you think white parents would say, no, send the kids?
Okay. What's your name?
And that they would send all of their white children into these spaces with mostly Black teachers and allow Black teachers to have these white babies all day? You think they would do that? I'm not so sure that they would.
John from Kansas City on line 1.
It looks like we have a caller, John from Kansas City. Let's hear from John.
I just turned on the radio. I listen to KKFI all the time, but I hadn't heard your program. So then I was listening to what you were talking about. Fully agree. I thought that I called into Evans before too on Wednesday night. But you are so right. Let me tell you this. I'm a 74-year-old white man. I date Black women only, and that's because they seem to understand things better than white women. I will say this too, though. I grew up in Kansas City in a fairly racist society, and would not ever thought about being with a Black woman and saying hi. And it's really been interesting to me because I find that, and I advise some of my Black friends to be careful with the white people. They can talk a line, but they still harbor certain sentiments. And I had a Black female friend that went with me to when I did year 11, and I had plenty of equity, but I went into a loan agency, which I won't mention, and they turned me down. They were really unusually rude. So I went to an affiliate agency agency where I had a friend of mine who I trusted that worked there, and she says it's because it was a black woman. And I don't get it because their business is to loan money and make money, and both of them told me that's the way it works.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is very late in life for me. I mean, I was fairly liberal, fairly savvy, I think, in a lot of ways before that. But it was the first time, and I told both my friends, I said, it's the first time I felt and so that is that's the great thing that I did. People that
We can just thank him and we'll take it off the air.
So entrenched.
Yes, John. I'm so grateful that you brought that up because it's so true. So for those of you who are online and not listening in, John called in to say that very late in life, and he's like in his 70s, he said very late in life, he went to a banking institution with a black female friend, and it was a place he went regularly, and all of a sudden that they were being rude to him. And another white friend told him that the reason for that was because he was with a black woman. So, that you might not believe that from John, but let me just share some stats with you from 2007. There was an analysis done in the Wall Street Journal that said that Chase Bank was coaxing black people into double-digit interest rates not related to their credit score. So now their homes are being taxed with these annual percentage rates of double digits simply because they have black skin. We know, based on the data, this has been well documented and proven, that banking institution, Mercedes-Benz just a few years ago got hit with fines for charging black people more, greater rates. Now imagine this black tax, but imagine it were a white tax. What would you want to happen if you were a white person and you know that you were paying a little extra just because of the color of your skin? That there was an entire analysis done by the Wall Street Journal. This is not opinion. It's been evidence-based and proven. It is factual that yes, banking institutions are doing that. And when you get the first biracial president of the United States, instead of helping y'all white people, what does he do? Bail out the banks. What would you want to happen? What would you want to happen? And if he said, you know what, these banks are too big to fail, and you lost your house and you saw the racial wealth gap just broaden and broaden and broaden, but it was white people at the bottom of this list, you will start to see that this is not some anomaly, what John is sharing with us in his personal experience and his black female friend at the bank. This is the rule. And if this is the rule, why is it that when we start talking about closing wealth gaps, one of the first things that we start talking about is how much black people spend or what black people choose to invest in versus how they choose to spend their money? All of those things are not factual. They are racist tropes that have been perpetuated throughout the years, and then we just start saying them. When you know that if it were white people at the other end of these data points, you would do something differently. That means we have to do something differently. We have to do something differently. And I think if you have not done so, this idea of trading spaces for every single situation that happens in your life, imagine the person were white if they were black, and imagine they were black if they were white, and then see how your opinion changes. And don't fight it. You know what the answer is. You'd be pissed. I got some folks following on social media, and they said that I got some friends from Canada following in. They said they'd be really, really mad. I think it's time now for us to go to a quick commercial break, and we will be right back.
It comes from Union Station and Auschwitz, the exhibition. Not long ago, not far away. The exhibition at Union Station features over 700 original objects and over 400 historic images. This comprehensive exhibition is dedicated to the history of Auschwitz and its role in the Holocaust. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away. The exhibition. Now extended through March at Union Station. More information and reserved tickets are available now at unionstation.org.
This is Jeremy Roth Kushel, co-host and producer of Understanding Israel Palestine Beyond the Walls. Listen in this Friday morning at 9:30 a.m. when I speak with cultural historian and author Walter Hickson about his recently published books, Architects of Repression, How Israel and its Lobby Put Racism, Violence, and Injustice at the Center of U.S. Middle East Policy, and Imperialism and War, The History Americans Need to Own. Once again, that's Understanding Israel Palestine Beyond the Walls, this Friday at 9:30 a.m.
Hey everyone, Chef Pat here, a volunteer programmer at KKFI. KKFI has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity right now to amp up for the future and secure access to our tower forever and remove over $21,000 in rent that we pay every year by purchasing an easement, which is a restriction placed on the property where our tower sits. Purchasing the easement gives KKFI permanent access for repairs and upgrades no matter who owns the land. To learn more about how to support this $350,000 campaign, go to kkfi.org/ampup or call 888-931-0901. We only have until March 31st, 2022, and I'm very happy to say the first $97,000 will be matched
30
by a
seconds. I'm
generous
going to
group of
come on and just
KKFI
reintroduce the
supporters.
show and
Please
introduce you
consider
and
this
then
gift
hand it
above
off.
what you normally do for KKFI.
Okay, and then
And
do we
double
need the
your
disclaimer
birthday
again?
gift
No.
right
Okay.
now, or make it a larger gift over a couple of years. All the info is at
You are listening to 90.1 FM KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio. This is the Racial Justice Initiative's Thursday night special stand-up with Dr. Nicole Price.
Well, welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. I am so excited about presenting this idea of trading spaces and imagining if the things that were happening to Black people were actually happening to white people. How would we adjust our behavior, our points of view, our perspectives? And this week, I am actually a fan of Mayor Quentin Lucas, so I will just put that out there before I criticize him. I criticize people I love, and I also criticize people I don't particularly like either. But when I'm criticizing you in love, it is because I want you to do better, and I believe that you can. And our fearless mayor this week agreed with the Kansas City Police Department that if we would get guns out of our communities, that would reduce violent crime. Now, violent crime has been studied by trauma surgeons all over this country, and removing weapons from areas where crime is high is not even in the top 5. And here's why. Do you know who has weapons in this country? It's not usually people who are committing violent crimes. There are 2 guns for every U.S. citizen in this country. You know, I think if you follow me on social media, you might know that I actually purchased 2 AR-15s in the exact same day at a gun show just to see, because I'm curious. You know, people say that it's easier to get an AR-15 than it is to get a puppy. And guess what? It is. I handed over my driver's license, and the next thing you know, I was walking out with a gun and 20 pounds of ammunition. 2 guns, excuse me. 2 guns and 20 pounds of ammunition. And here's what I think is interesting. And this is a guess, but upwards of 98% of the people that I saw at that gun show were white people. Most of the guns in this country, and when I say most, I mean greater than 80% of the guns in this country belong to white people in places that you would likely call safe. So I'd like you to think about the last time you went out of town here in the United States. And how did you know in that new city whether or not you were in a safe part of town or if you were in a part of town that had violent crime? How did you know that? And when I ask people to think about that, I want you to think about it for just a moment. What kinds of things do you notice in safe parts of town? And I'm using air quotes over here. We're on the radio. You can't see my fingers. In safe parts of town, you see grocery stores, You see easements and curbs that are beautiful. You see planted flowers, and not by individuals, by the municipality. You see banks and schools that don't look like prisons. The schools have windows and huge facilities. Now, unless you go to private school, all these things are paid for by tax dollars. You'll see beautiful light poles, interestingly designed, nice wayfinding. Now, when you go to a town and you know that you're in a violent part of town, how do you know? How do you know? Imagine you don't even see any people. You see payday loan places. You don't see banks. You see convenience stores where there's food there. And do you see grocery stores? Not at all. Not at all. When you see the schools, if you manage to go in, they'd be like going into correctional facilities. There hasn't been one mass shooting at a K through 12 school in an urban center in this nation. And yet when you walk in, somebody's going to go through your bag. You've got metal detectors. When was the last time you've seen anything like that at a suburban school? Because it is unconscionable. You would not do it. So as an exercise, I want you to go and visit a school that you're not used to going to. And imagine if you're walking into a school that is predominantly Black. Imagine those children were white. And tell me, would you put them through that terror every day? Tell me what you think their learning experience would be like. And then I want you to walk into a school in a suburban or rural area where most of the kiddos are white. And when you walk in, it's just open space, beautifully designed buildings, lots of opportunities for learning. And imagine that that's where the Black kids went. And see how long it would take for us to change these things. And so my issue with Mayor Q was simply this: violent crime is directly tied to, do you have affordable housing? Because guess what? If you can't find a place to live, you might do some desperate things. If you cannot find good food to eat, then you might resort to some desperate things. If you, by and large, don't have green space that when you are frustrated, you can just go to the park and kind of walk it off, that might cause you to do some desperate things. If you don't have schools that are very well funded, that don't have zero tolerance policies, so you don't have education, you don't have access to food, and you don't have affordable housing, and somehow you don't think that that has something to do with violent crime, you think it just has to do with all these guns that these little heathens have. And I think that therein lies our problem. We always want to address the overt racism, and I am telling you that it is these subtle things, like the mayor of a city with over 500,000 people getting on social media and saying the way we reduce violent crime is getting rid of these guns. Black people don't have guns, y'all. And I want you to imagine that the weaponry in this country was 2-1, and it was Black people who had them. What would we want to see happen? Trading spaces. What would we want to see happen? We have historical evidence of what would happen. Do you know when the Black Panthers were walking the streets of California with weapons on their sides, we have never in the history of this country seen some type of reform around gun control ever until we saw those Black people with guns. The Harvard Implicit Bias Assessment, if you have not taken the project Implicit Bias Assessment, I invite you to do so. Because it is the way that we measure our implicit biases, not our overt biases. I want you to take that implicit bias test if you have not. But there's one in there that says, who do you associate weaponry with? And when you look at the results of Harvard's 27 years worth of research on this topic, most people associate weaponry with Black folks. Why is that? Because guess what? We don't have guns, y'all. Do you know when I bought those 2 AR-15s, I spent $3,000? Who has $3,000 to spend on some guns? It's a complete waste of money, but it was a social experiment because I just could not believe it. When I went to adopt a puppy from Wayside Waifs, I had to fill out 2 pages of forms. They wanted to see me interact with the dog. They wanted to know where I was living. I got none of those questions about a gun. So if you want to think that Black people equals poor people, because we're inferior and all, according to Mr. Doug, who doesn't think that Black people should go to HBCUs, then how is it that we then have the money to spend thousands of dollars on assault rifles? If weaponry, illegal weaponry is our issue with violent crime, where are we getting all this money? Where's the money? Who's giving us these weapons? Who's giving us these weapons? And see, so we have to pay attention to what we are repeating, because sometimes what we're repeating just is not accurate. It's just not even accurate. And that goes for the mayor too. So I invite you, if you're listening, go to Harvard's implicit association test. They have several assessments you can take. Some are on race, some are on things like weaponry, weight, all kinds of things. But take the assessments, because that'll show you where you're more likely to have these unconscious biases that cause you to support these ideas that are not all that affirming to all people. And I maintain that, just like with my trainer, even though white people might have the power, they're the ones that are being hurt by their desire to kind of leave a large segment of the population out. We have no idea what we're missing out on because we cannot get over ourselves as it relates to racism. Subtle thing that just happened to me today. I went to a local 7-Eleven and I was just shopping away because it was convenient. I was looking for Mango Cart, this beer that I like. Don't tell my trainer. And when I get to the counter to pay, the worker there says, well, will this be an EBT card? Now, if you're not familiar with EBT, it is federal subsidy to get food. I don't have an issue with EBT. I grew up using food stamps before it was called EBT. They had the little paper coupons, because when you don't have enough to eat, it is really nice if you can get some subsidy. But what is it about me that at a random 7-Eleven would cause the worker, because I saw several other people pay before me, and he didn't ask any of them was it going to be EBT, and they were paying with the card. So what is it about my little black skin in the white Brookside that would cause the white worker at 7-Eleven to say, are you using an EBT card? And I imagine that if this were reverse, if this were a black person saying to a white person, is this going to be an EBT card, that they would lose their job in that moment. In that moment. How dare you? How dare you? And so the thing that we have to learn how to do is to just switch things in their minds. I know for sure, though, based on my reaction, that he said, oh, I was just asking because I have to ring it up differently. Sir, stop. No, you don't. No, you don't. So there's one other thing in particular, 2 things actually I want to talk about, but I want to finish this idea around schooling. And then I want to talk about traffic and race, because I just finished reading Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 Project, and I learned that traffic is even related to racism. Who knew that? Who knew that? But schools. So Brown versus the Board of Education. Malcolm Gladwell has a podcast called Revisionist History. If you don't listen, I think it's really good. You should listen in. But he was the one who shared with me that imagine that you're going to integrate schools, and these are black schools that have all the resources, all the teachers, and we're keeping white children out. White children by law in certain places cannot be funded. In certain states, like that, you're not funding these white schools. They don't deserve it. and you systemically are keeping them out of black schools. And the white people get their best lawyers to say, listen, I'm paying taxes, so I want my kid to be able to go to whatever school I'm paying taxes for. Would you send your white children into these all black spaces? Now, before you answer too swiftly, I want you to think about the times when you've been in all black spaces and how you behaved. Have you been to an all black church? Have you gone to an all black barbershop? How'd you feel when you went to the soul food restaurant at 12 o'clock on Sunday? Did you feel a little out of place? Have you been to Essence Festival? Have you been anywhere where you realized you were the only one? And how did you act? How did you act? Now imagine that was the same day in and day out. Now, would you send your little white baby into that black school? See, now, for those of you who are thinking you'd say yes, I think you're saying yes because I can't find even 10 or 12 black people who would do some harm to a white child. Like, I can't even find that, right? So you know that black teachers are not going to harm your white baby. So your answer might be yes. Your answer might be yes. But here's what happened instead here in the U.S. Imagine this. The day the legislation of Brown versus Board of Education passed, there were 80,000 black teachers here in the U.S. The very next day, there were 41,000. 39,000 black teachers were fired the day Brown versus Board of Education passed. You know why? Because white people not only did not want their children going to school with black children, they did not want black teachers teaching their children. So we don't have the numbers of what it looked like by the end of the week, by the end of the month, by the end of the year. But today in K through 12 education, 83% of teachers are white and female. Now, I want you to imagine a world in which 83% of the teachers are black and male. What would you be asking for? I know. We got to tear this whole system down. No. I want some reparations. My teachers were fired back in 1950, whatever. You need to repair all of the harm that has been done for the students who have not seen representation of themselves since then. And I want to make sure this never happens again. I want representation on the judiciary. I want representation in Congress. I want representation at the federal, state, local level. We know what you want. Because when you can think about it as if it were you, we know what's necessary. I don't even get into arguments with folks anymore. I just ask them to trade the spaces. Trade the spaces. When you look at the insurrection that happened at the Capitol on January 6th, my only question was, imagine that those were black people storming the Capitol with guns and gallows on the Capitol lawn. What would happen? We know because we have historical evidence from history. They would have been bombed from the sky by the federal government. We know. A couple weeks ago, there's a student, I think he was from Africa. If anybody knows what country he was from, feel free to call in and tell me because I've forgotten. But he's a medical student and he was trying to increase representation in the medical profession. And he drew a black mother with a black baby in utero. And I am 45 years old. And it had not only had I never seen one, Luis, I didn't even recognize that representation was missing. I was so used to seeing white. So used to seeing white that I was so shocked to see a black mother with the baby in utero. Now imagine that all the imagery you saw in the medical profession were black people. Every single image. I want you to pick up your favorite magazine and every picture where you see a white person, I want you to change it to a black face. And then tell me, do you think that magazine represents you? Every commercial you watch, I want you to imagine that you see Black people on the screen with shampoo. Let's imagine that every time you turned on the television, wherever you saw a white face, there was a Black face. What would you want to happen? Some of y'all couldn't even take that we had a biracial president, and we know that some of y'all can't take that we have a biracial vice president right now. Right now, just too much reverse discrimination. I think that's what they call it. Isn't that what they call them? Reverse discrimination. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's it. And our ability, honestly, to put yourself in the shoes of another is nothing but empathy. That's it. That's it. And we have the ability to do this. And I would love to know why we think we don't. Like, why don't we? Why don't we? Because I know I'm tired of hearing people say why we don't have the teachers representing us. Well, because you fired them all. You fired them all. Why would I go back to that profession? Why would I ever go back to that profession? I would not. I wouldn't go back to that profession. You couldn't pay me. Couldn't pay me to. Now today, folks say, oh, we don't know why we can't find Black teachers. You can always take it all the way back to some racist idea. Now let's talk about traffic. I know all of you are listening are very, very familiar with redlining. It got its home here in Kansas City. This idea that there are certain neighborhoods that we would redline on a map. And then in those spaces, banks were encouraged not to fund mortgages or offer mortgages in those spaces. And it didn't matter if you were Black or white. You could not get a mortgage in a red line space. And so because of this redlining that occurred in it, and we'll just talk about Atlanta, because I think the traffic in Atlanta is like worst in the country. I think it might be. It's Atlanta or LA. It's actually not New York. I can't remember. I think let's just go with Atlanta. So what they did was they ran I-20 right around the Black area of town. And it was designed, so this red line that happened on the map, they used the interstate highway to corner it off from the white people. You can see the same thing here in Kansas City. There's a highway that runs pretty much right between the east and west parts of town. There's a highway that runs directly across the north and south. And then this entire thing is encapsulated by a loop. And most major cities are designed the exact same way. And so I got this from the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones. And it's on page 408 if you ever want to take a look at it. It says, while interstates were regularly used to destroy Black neighborhoods, they were also used to keep Black and white neighborhoods apart. Today, major roads and highways serve as stark dividing lines between Black and white sections in cities like Buffalo, Hartford, Kansas City. We got an honorable mention in Nicole Hannah-Jones's book, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis. In Atlanta, the intent to segregate was crystal clear. Interstate 20, the east-west corridor that connects I-75 with I-85, was deliberately plotted along a winding route in the late 1950s. And listen here, the mayor, Bill Hartsfield at the time, and the airport's named after this guy. He said, as a boundary between the white and Negro communities. Now, here's what's interesting. Because of that racist idea from the 1950s, today the traffic patterns in Atlanta are all out of whack and cattywampus, and it takes an average worker in Atlanta an extra 2 hours a week of commuting because of a historical racist idea. You can't get the MARTA to run from certain parts of town to other parts of town because you know what? We don't want those people out here. So even in a traffic situation, what we have done is convinced ourselves that violent crime in unsafe communities is based on where people live rather than systemic oppression. Overtly leaving people out, quartering people off, and it's costing Every single last one of us. So I want to leave you with the final idea, final thought. It is really, really hard to demonstrate empathy when we are one of the most individualistic countries in the world. We care so much about ourselves and not everyone else. But racism is costing all of us. And so I want to leave you with this idea. Every single time you see a scenario and it is race-based, before you say, don't play the race card, or this isn't a racial issue, because people like to suggest that what's happening with the police here in Kansas City is not a racial issue. But I maintain that if every time I say Black Lives Matter, you say Blue Lives Matter, you understand that there is a racial component to policing. Why would you respond to Black Lives Matter with somebody's job? Because you understand that job is racialized. So every time you see something that has a racial undertone, what I want you to do is to just swap the demographics and see how you would respond. In banking, imagine it were white people who got charged extra. In schools, imagine that all the teachers, imagine 98% of the superintendents were Black and male. Imagine all of those students all those schools that are funded, imagine they were Black schools that were funded and the white ones were underfunded. Imagine that. Imagine when you decided that you were going to have a baby, that you were more likely to die in childbirth, even if you had a terminal degree, because you were white. Imagine that. What would you want to see happen? Imagine that if because you were white, you were more likely to be the victim of environmental injustices, causing most of your children to have asthma. Would you let that be? Don't let that be. This has been KKFI, the Racial Justice Initiative, Trading Spaces. As always, love having you on. Good night.
The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a pimple and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Shape of War Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Junior. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution
Thank y'all for joining.
The revolution will not make you look.
I got to figure out how y'all can hear when people call in. Love y'all. Bye.
There will be no pictures